Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Oonagh Fitzgerald. I'm an artist and a senior fellow with the Human Rights Research and Education Centre at the University of Ottawa, and a director of the Canadian branch of the International Law Association. I'm also the editor of CIGI's newest book, Corporate Citizen: New Perspectives on the Globalized Rule of Law, which explores the legal frameworks and standards of conduct for multinational corporations. Today's virtual event is co-hosted by the Centre for International Governance Innovation, CIGI, and the University of Ottawa's Human Rights Research and Education Centre. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that CIGI sits on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. CIGI is situated on the Haldimand Tract, the land promised to the Six Nations that includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. We also acknowledge the location of the University of Ottawa on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. As this is a virtual event, you may be joining us from another traditional territory, and we encourage you to do some research to learn more about the land on which you live, work, and play. Today's session examines the impact of multinational corporations on the environment, including looking at this from Indigenous storytelling perspectives. Expert panelists discuss how corporations are responding to the growing societal call for climate action and green transition to a no-carbon economy. They will consider how government and industry action in the coming months could strengthen environmental justice and shape a green, sustainable recovery from COVID-19. As Andrea mentioned, we'll be taking audience questions via the Q&A function in Zoom. So please do submit your questions by hitting the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and typing them in. And you can submit questions at any time, and we'll do our best to answer them. So let me begin by saying a few words about the book that this conference celebrates. Domestic corporate law and international trade and investment law are the handmaidens of globalization, facilitating the growth of global supply chains and the rise of multinational corporations with operations all around the world. These laws provide financial benefits and legal protections for these global corporate citizens, but are not always well designed to hold corporations to account for long-lasting environmental impacts of their operations and their conduct outside their home jurisdiction. The last 200 years of industrialization resulted in accelerated degradation of all natural systems and now poses an existential threat to all of us. The problems are so vast that they can only be tackled by concerted efforts by all levels of government, the corporate sector, and civil society. We wrote Corporate Citizen to examine the role of the multinational corporation in today's global economy and to explain how domestic and international law could be strengthened to encourage the development of consistent and enhanced standards of human rights, labor, and environmental conduct. The book examines the modern multinational corporation from many different angles and in a diversity of voices. It's written by experts in international economic law, Indigenous law and human rights, investment law, and environmental law. The chapters examine how domestic and international laws shape the corporation's freedom to operate globally. The book is arranged in 5 parts. First, it discusses how legal frameworks are really straining at the boundaries to address the challenges presented by multinational corporations. Second, the book looks at how different accountability frameworks are taking shape. Third, it discusses whether corporate conduct sufficiently reflects evolving societal values. We're seeing interesting developments on that front. Even today, there was an announcement by Shell and a few weeks ago by BP about new ideas they're taking to address some of the environmental impacts of their operations. Fourth, the book examines how foreign investor obligations are gradually starting to come into focus. The book, Corporate Citizen, concludes by examining how institutions are beginning to articulate a tentative vision of transnational justice applicable to multinational corporations. As we were finalizing the book, the Supreme Court of Canada rendered its decision in Nevson Resources versus Araya providing an interesting hint at what transnational justice might mean. This year, the pandemic has highlighted the interconnectedness and interdependence of global economic, environmental, health, and justice systems. By examining the complexities of the multinational corporation in international law and governance, the book presents the possibility of corporate law that strives to align our human need for economic security with our need for justice, human rights, public health, and a healthy natural environment. To learn more about the book, Corporate Citizen, you can follow the links provided in the chat function. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce you to today's moderator, Janis Sarra. Janis is a professor of law at Peter A. Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia, and she's the founding director of the National Center for Business Law, also at the university. She is also the principal co-investigator of the Canada Climate Law Initiative, a research collaboration between UBC and York University. Janis is also the Canadian investigator of the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative at Oxford University. Over to you, Janis.
Thank you very much, Oonagh. And first, let me say congratulations to you and all of the authors for a remarkable contribution to very important discussions on the nature of the corporation and also how we think about its evolution in respect of civil society, the environment, and other really important timely topics. This is a very exciting book, and I commend it to absolutely everyone. As Oonagh mentioned, I'm coming to you from UBC, and I can say that I am honored to work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam peoples. Very fortunate indeed, and also to be with you today. I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists, but the full bios are going to be posted in the chat room if you'd like more information. We're going to have a conversation, and as Oonagh said, we'll welcome your questions and answers, but we have a few questions and answers we're going to start with. So Darcy Lindberg is an assistant professor with the University of Alberta Faculty of Law, and he teaches courses on constitutional law, Indigenous legal orders, treaties, and Indigenous environmental law. He is author of Chapter 8 in the book, which is titled Wakotowin and Restoring Humane Relationality within the Transnational Corporation. Sandra Odendahl is Vice President of Social Impact and Sustainability at Scotiabank with almost 25 years of experience in environmental science, corporate sustainability, and responsible finance. So welcome. And finally, Doug Sarro, not Sarah, no relation. He's some Bombardier Scholar and doctoral candidate at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law. And he is a co-author with Ed Waitzer of Chapter 6 of the book, titled Climate Change, a New Bellwether of a Corporate Accountability for Systemic Risks. So on that note, I'm just going to launch into the conversation. And my first question to all of you is really talking a bit about the current state of affairs in terms of business and the environment. So in recent decades, as we all know, there's been growing concern about the environmental impact of the activities of corporations, particularly multinational corporations, and also a growing awareness of the need for them to contribute towards adapting and mitigating global warming. So in your view, what are multinational enterprises doing to address these issues themselves? How do international organizations, governments, et cetera, fit into that? And how do we think about the current state of responsibility globally in respect to the corporation and the environment? So I'm going to start with you, Doug.
First off, it's great to be here, and thanks so much for the question. I'll focus my response on litigation as a tool for fostering corporate accountability and for demonstrating to corporate leaders where legal expectations are moving. Columbia University has an online database of every climate change lawsuit brought around the world, stretching back to the 1980s. Hit refresh on it this morning, and the count is almost 1,700. And that includes almost 150 filed in the last year. Now, a lot of this litigation will fail, and litigation that succeeds is going to move the law by inches rather than miles. But in the chapter I wrote with Ed Waitzer, we argue that this litigation provides enough data points that we can start to understand the trajectory of the law so that corporate leaders can get ahead of it. We argue that at a high level, what we're seeing is a movement from norms grounded in rationality to norms grounded in reasonableness. Now, what on earth does that mean? I think it's easier to explain with a case study. Luigi Zingales and Roy Shapira wrote a paper about a settlement that the chemical company DuPont entered into in 2017. It had to do with their emitting a toxic chemical called C8 into the atmosphere over a number of decades. C8 is used to make Teflon. They found that at the time the decision to pollute was made, DuPont's managers understood that C8 was toxic. They also knew that there were ways they could mitigate the amount of C8 they were emitting into the atmosphere. And they also knew that the cost of putting those mitigation measures into place would be less than the damage to the environment and human health that would be caused by just letting the stuff out uncontrolled. And yet they decided to pollute anyway with no abatement measures. The reasoning was, well, first off, this cost isn't borne by shareholders, it's borne by other people. Second off, sure, somebody might bring a claim, but they'd have to find out that we were responsible first. So got to think about probability of detection. Second, it's going to take a while for this litigation to work its way through the courts. So you discount by the amount of time it'll take from discovery to litigation and settlement. And that hints at the third discount factor, the likelihood that plaintiff's counsel will accept a settlement that's lower than the total environmental and human health cost imposed by pollution. In a way, you could say that that reasoning is rational, but I think we could all agree that it's not reasonable. So in the chapter, we sketch out what reasonableness looks like in terms of corporate directors' duties of loyalty and care. Very quickly, loyalty, we say, doesn't mean loyalty to shareholders, it means loyalty to the corporation. And the Supreme Court of Canada has led the way in saying that that duty means an obligation to treat all stakeholders fairly. With respect to the duty of care, it means a duty to monitor for risks of harm to all stakeholders caused by corporate conduct. And in fact, that's something investors increasingly are demanding. So those are a couple of pathways that we sketch out in the chapter for how litigation and the trajectory of the law is something that corporate leaders can anticipate and start adapting to now.
Terrific. Thanks, Doug. Darcy, I'm going to turn over to you now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for, I just want to acknowledge it's an honor to be invited here to talk about this as well. I'm coming from Amisquitchie, Waskahegan, also known as Edmonton. So it's great to reach across the virtual sphere to everybody here. So I was thinking about this question, and there's two things to consider that are important. And one is the idea of Indigenous laws. So Indigenous nations provide law and governance that can help draw out our thinking on corporate liability and responsibility towards the land specifically. And then the second one is when we think in a transnational context, Indigenous nations have this transnational experience that can be really important in how we think about stretching across jurisdictions of when we think of states, so nation states. We actually have a lot of nations, Indigenous nations that flow across our borders. So here I'm thinking about Canada and the United States border, and what lessons we can draw on that help us think about those barriers for corporate responsibility that we do see here. So I do want to ground this, much like Doug did, in a case study, so to speak, but more so a nation. So I think about the Vuntut Gwitchin. So they're a nation that is in the northern part of Canada in the United States, so in the Yukon Territory here, and their relationship with caribou is vitally important. And so this has actually been the grounds where they've thought about how they address this question of corporate responsibility, because they find that their relationship is intimately tied with the caribou. So it's not only a question of substance, of ceremonies, of that life. They've lived in concert with caribou for at least 12,000 years. Some research says it's 29,000 years. And what they've done is they've actually developed a highly, so there's long history and highly developed legal system on their relationship with caribou. And to the point where they talk about, there's some people from the community, they talk about them being as almost like the same, and to have this this connection. They have these stories that allow them to have a kinship with the caribou. So this is all an important part of their law. So all this is to say that they have these transnational lessons that we can look at, because what the Untitled Chapter, the challenge that they have is they have to deal with two jurisdictions. So in Canada here, they have land claims that they've settled. So they have self-governance according to self-governing agreements with Canada. As a part of this, it's land management. So they've set out how they're going to deal with the territory here in Canada, but it also actually extends into the United States. So the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, so ANWR, is a part of this. And what it is the caribou, they go and they calve in this area up there as well. And so what the Untitled Chapter have had to do is they've had to find a way to advocate across those borders. They've had to go to the United States, they've had to go to DC in order to make this kind of advocacy. They've had to call on the Canadian government to do this as well. And so when we start to look at the lessons of the Untitled Chapter, it maybe just formalizes it a little bit more of what we heard even in the answer before, that obviously the environmental harms that are occurring through corporations are flowing across borders, jurisdiction, and we see this with the caribou. So I just want to, as a starting point, to draw that out here, because we actually do see a lot of movement in there. There's been a lot of financial organizations have said that they're actually taking into account this position of the Untitled Chapter, and they're not going to fund explorations of this part of the Arctic, including here in Canada, the Royal Bank and BMO, or maybe we'll hear a little bit more about that as well. So we could see that I wanted to share this is actually a really positive thing, and to draw people into further down the thinking of not just being a moral stance of like we need to protect this species that's so vital to the Untitled Chapter, but we can actually look to their laws as way to guide on how we deal with those transnational relationships. So I'll probably get into more in a further answer here, so I'm going to park it there.
Thank you, Darcy. And I think an important piece of that, of course, is the leadership that could be shared in these issues. And I think, Canada is slowly coming to that, but it's going to take a bit more time. So Sandra.
Thank you very much. And like the others, I want to say thank you very much for including me as part of the panel. Okay, so now for something completely different. When I look at your, when I thought about your question about what can multinationals be doing in terms of addressing environmental issues and climate change specifically, I'm going to be a little bit more tactical in terms of what I see organizations, multinationals doing, and I'm actually going to start with banks, but I have a couple of points to make that I think tie into some things that are driven by law and some things that are driven by other influences that are determining where companies are going in addressing environmental issues. I'm going to start with banks because I actually work at one, and in terms of in terms of the strategies that banks have been taking over a number of years to help mitigate environmental impacts, contribute to climate action, it's really interesting because banks, of course, are are themselves not directly, they're not directly big polluters. They're not directly doing many of the things that emit compounds into the environment. But of course, banks are enablers of the economy. So, for some time now, banks have absolutely looked at what their clients are doing, and more recently, and I would say increasingly, are being expected to take a stronger stance to push client companies in certain directions. So some of the things that I can tell you that banks do with regard to environment, I'm going to talk about 3 buckets actually. So, I mean, the first thing that banks do is they mobilize capital. So they mobilize money. In terms of providing capital, there's a couple of ways that banks move the needle on addressing environmental issues. One is providing capital to things that help clients, help companies in the transition to doing things better. And certainly in climate change, we're seeing a lot of that, where companies are making investments, and in some cases they need external financial resources in order to do that. And the other way, of course, is financing new things that are sort of the next way to do things that are environmentally and potentially socially less deleterious. So, sorry, just a sec. If I were to give an example on that, and again, I'm going to just focus for a second on the work that we've done at Scotiabank. An example of mobilizing capital is, for example, a year ago, we made a commitment that over the next 5 years, we'll mobilize $100 billion in capital specifically directed to reducing the impacts of climate change. And there's certain taxonomy and rules for what counts towards that target. But it really has focused the attention of our bankers, our risk managers, and other divisions in the bank on, thinking about the kinds of conversations we have with clients and the different opportunities we have to enable, the economy to move in that direction. And we're about to tally up our 2020 numbers, but for example, at the end of 2019, we reported that we had mobilized 16 billion. So we're trending towards meeting our target, and it's really stimulated a lot of additional activity in the bank. The launch of a sustainable financing team that helps companies underwrite green bonds, all sorts of impetus for more activity that supports a greener economy. So that's on mobilizing capital. The second thing, and I would suggest it's something banks have been doing for at least a couple of decades, is environmental and social risk management. So banking is about, managing risk. And it's really about making sure that if you provide funds to somebody, that they're going to be able to pay it back, is, one of the important foundational principles of banking. So for many years, one of the roles that, that was in most banks, and now it's definitely in all banks, but I was one of the people in one of the earlier teams on this early in my career, was environmental risk management. So what that was looking at the kinds of deals that banks do with clients, so lending money in particular, and looking at whether, and in certain situations, particularly if there's real estate, like property involved that could be contaminated, or if it's a huge development that could have social and environmental impacts in particular, going back many years, you would do an environmental and social risk assessment to confirm that the client's environmental issues would not cause enough problems to the client that would give them problems in terms of repaying debt. very basic, and you could argue it was absolutely meant to protect the banks, but actually it also served the purpose of forcing banks to ask questions to clients, to understand the business activities, to understand where they were doing business, what kinds of contaminants might be coming out of the property, what was there previously, was it affecting any neighbors. So while environmental credit risk management is designed to absolutely protect the bank and its shareholders and investors and its clients, it actually does also protect the environment, and actually in many cases protected clients who may not have delved into some of these questions, particularly smaller clients who wouldn't think of this necessarily. So that's the second one. And then the third way that I think banking plays a role, and there are a number of them, but the third one I actually think is, it's actually plays a role in because we deal with all sorts of different companies in different sectors and different geographies. Really having a role in synthesizing, compiling, and putting together good information, research, and collaboration across sectors and across different interests. So like we put out research, ESG research papers on what's happening in environmental, social, and governance issues that could affect investors, that could affect our clients, et cetera. We participate in a number of different collaborations, multinational organizations. So the UN Environment Program has a finance initiative for at least 20 some years. The Equator Principles it's an international kind of a self-governing group of banks from around the world who established principles on how you do project financing with really careful assessment of environmental, social impact. So there's a level playing field among banks who may come together from a lot of different jurisdictions to finance a big development. Everybody's kind of working off the same playbook. I'm going to stop there. There's a lot more, of course, that I could say about what the actual multinationals do, but I'm going to leave it for now with that.
Okay, thank you, Sandra. I just want to turn for a moment to COVID-19, which is very much on everybody's mind. And of course, ironically, the fact that the virus has been able to spread so widely is partly due to global warming. And we have sort of a couple of effects. One has been, of course, reduced carbon emissions from lack of business travel, et cetera, but at the same time, a massive upscaling of the use of one-time use plastics. So it's been a very mixed message in terms of environmental protection. I was going to start with you, Sandra, but since you just gave a long answer, I'll give you a minute to catch your breath and turn to Doug and just really think about what role corporations can play or are playing in respect of the climate change dimensions of COVID-19.
The pandemic has really illustrated the fragility of the social and environmental systems that we depend on and that corporations depend on. It's shown us how easily the daily life we take for granted can be disrupted and radically changed, and with it, entire industries and ways of doing business. You open any corporate law textbook and you'll find something telling you that a corporation is a nexus of contracts. I don't think that's quite right. I think the better answer is a corporation is a nexus of relationships. Relationships among shareholders, managers, creditors, sure, but also communities, nations, lands, and ecological systems. And the case law is increasingly recognizing that. The pandemic has rippled through these webs of relationships, disrupting all our lives. Some companies have recognized that they too are embedded in these webs of relationships and have taken action in response, pivoting to producing PPE and getting it where it's needed, supporting healthcare workers, pivoting to making hand sanitizer and getting that out to the market. And there's evidence that this kind of attention to the interests of non-financial stakeholders is actually beneficial for financial stakeholders as well. I saw a study last week. It was put out by this group called the CEO Investor Forum where they look at the stock performance of various public companies, and they found that companies with a clear sense of corporate purpose that's operationalized, that recognizes the importance of their relationships with stakeholders, these companies actually outperformed companies that didn't have that sense of purpose. They also found that these companies were better at weathering or have been better at weathering the pandemic than these other companies. Now, the thing with empirical studies is there are always ways you can quibble with them, and I'm sure skeptics will find things to quibble with. But my reaction was think about, why is that the case? I think it may be that adopting a stakeholder mindset opens your mind to new solutions that actually benefit everyone, but that wouldn't be obvious if you were putting on your shareholder value blinders. I think that kind of vision is important for getting through the current crisis. And in kind of a roundabout way, to get back to the question, I think that mindset dictates paying greater attention to the environmental and climate change impacts of COVID and how business interacts with that.
Thank you. I think I'd also agree with you. I, in my own view, with the pandemic, never have interests of the company aligned so much with external stakeholders in terms of trying to puzzle this through. So Sandra, now I hope you caught your breath, and please go ahead.
Yeah, so, if your question is, has the pandemic sort of caused us to take our eye off of the environmental ball, I would say yes, temporarily. I mean, look, it's a 1 in 100-year event that kills people. So at the end of the day, corporations, governments, everybody, individuals have to make sure that people are taken care of. So, and in banks, of course, as in a lot of other companies, it's employees, it's customers, and it's communities. So yeah, I do think the environment has taken a bit of a back seat, and I completely hear you on the proliferation of single-use everything. It's like, oh my God, have we gone backwards? But then I'm comforted by the fact that, well, GHG emissions are down 9% in the first half of the year, and oh, well, that's good, maybe for all the wrong reasons. But I do think that, and I think I have to agree with Doug in some ways. What you said, Doug, is exactly what I'm thinking, is that the pandemic has actually given us some models for how we can address some of the environmental challenges that were perhaps less urgent and maybe killing us slowly instead of quickly, but need our attention in the long run. I think there's been some amazing examples of partnerships between corporations, like multi-sectoral partnerships, and some of them were mentioned, but I'm thinking about retooling, the government putting out a call for companies to put forward their funding proposals to retool their manufacturing facilities to make protective equipment. Incentives. Actually, we were involved in this really interesting little thing that turned into a national thing. The City of Toronto reached out, and we just sort of with a one-off conversation with one of the people with the city who was tasked with finding ways that companies could help. This was early in the pandemic. What were they doing to help the city? We came up with the idea that one of the things the small business owners didn't have was they weren't online. It hadn't been a priority before because they used to rely on walk-in traffic. So so we ended up getting our digital factory team, kind of like our nerdy digital engineers, to volunteer to basically build websites for a couple hundred businesses in Toronto so that they could get online. And then it was done with Shopify, and I can't remember the other partners, but at the end of the day, the government of Canada got wind of it. A lot of people were advocating for it, and it's actually now rolled out across the country to help companies do that. So I think that the pandemic, in the short run, of course, has taken us backwards on some environmental measures, but it's actually taught us, first of all, the importance of community cohesiveness. It's like a case study in we're all in this together. I mean, really big time, which I hope sticks. The importance of good government, that, government is important and good leadership is really important. The importance of the private sector, that again, we're all in this together, and you can't have thriving corporations in failed societies, or really societies that are suffering greatly. So we all have to pull together. So I'm hoping that those lessons, and I think you're already seeing it, those are translating into new approaches to addressing other social and environmental challenges. It's the silver lining.
Thank you, Sandra. Darcy.
Yeah, so this is such a great question. I've been thinking about this since it's been posed. And we have, like, from Indigenous nations perspective, there's been a lot of concerns about the suspension of environmental regulations, for example, in provinces because of the pandemic. And things like that, and I've been thinking quite a bit about where we see Indigenous corporations and their business and how it could help thinking about this moment in time. I really look at it, not only is this a terrible part of our history, but it's also, we have this moment to transform and learn as well. And what we see in Indigenous communities, I was thinking about this, so I'm not sure it's going to make sense. I have a bit of a cold, so maybe it's not even going to make sense at all. I'm just talking from the cold here, is what we see Indigenous corporations, they're really about a lot of them are about preventative production. So we're seeing a lot of production of energy. I'm thinking specifically here of like clean energy, what we call clean energy, like run of the river projects that create energy, solar farms, really fuel efficient homes, these kind of questions. So it's creating this I think about those as like preventative in a nature rather than a responding. And so that question about what we're doing right now, we're obviously responding to the pandemic in this very emergent time as well. And so what does this tell us about us is we really need to, this sort of biodiversity that we see within terms of like Indigenous energy projects, because it's quite varied. It's not relied on one sort of source across there, that this is a significant part of the protection. I mean, even if we go to like the roots of this pandemic, it's caused by the loss of that diversity, that biodiversity. We have this cross relating of a virus, essentially, that a lot of the experts do talk about. This is like the loss of biodiversity and ecological areas around the world means that we're actually going to be more at risk for further pandemics in the future as well. And so that's a lesson to take back with this, so we can think about how in all of our relations, like how are we supporting either preventative production or responsive production. That's the way I kind of categorize that. And so then there is this opportunity of change in corporate culture at this moment, right? And so I love how Doug puts it about as like a corporate purpose, and this idea of relationships is so important the way we think about this. So I think about what is the purpose that shareholders and funders have. And so we heard Sandra talk about from the banking perspective of that purpose. And I'm just going to put it out there, in these emergent times, sometimes it's really important not to make profits, right? Because we're taught that we need to take a step back and reassess it. And so again, I want to draw it back to like when we think about Indigenous legal traditions, we think about seasons in this way. We think about these seasons where we're really abundant, and in others it requires us to take a break, to think through and to reassess. And so that's kind of where I see this. I think it's a really big opportunity in this crisis to reassess and think about corporate purpose. So I really like the way Doug put it there. So I'm going to cap my thinking there.
Thank you. The next question is related, and maybe I'll just go right back to you, Darcy. But one could argue that some of the UN Sustainable Development Goals have been put a little bit on hold given the pandemic. And I think the challenge now will be to think about an economic recovery that is as green as possible, if we can call it that, and also really to look at new models of governance for companies. I'm privileged to live in British Columbia, where we have a number of models of joint leadership between, I'm thinking of the Haida Nation, Haida Gwaii, and that economic development of both the marine waters and the lands. Coast funds, which is a remarkable story, in my view, of protection of biodiversity over, the largest rainforest in the world. And so I'm just wondering what you think the role of government is, or government and business together, whether you think it requires legislation or whether you think that we can move forward to a green recovery just on a collaborative basis.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't want to always be like, it depends, but there's these relations. I like the way Doug put it as well, talking about like there's this nexus this relationships rather than a nexus of contracts. And that's kind of the way I've started to think about Indigenous government relations, because one of the values when we start to think about Indigenous legal ordering and governance, it decenters what we think about as like nation states, not in a way that is harmful to the nation states at all, really. But what it does is it allows us to really cut through a lot of the complexities when we think of like, how can a government really respond to this? The question I get from my students sometimes in constitutional law is, how can a Canadian government address climate change when the rest of the world doesn't? And I kind of look at it as like, well, you're building that relationship one at a time, right? And so when we think about governance as a municipal, or that example from Haida Gwaii is such a beautiful one. And there's these agreements between the province. There's also agreements between the federal government. There's also agreements between non-Indigenous peoples who are on Haida Gwaii as well. We can start to see this as like a fabric of social relations that I really think is we often turn away from that because it's too incremental. We really want to be like to have the silver bullet to this, but really that is where it's going to get us, right? And so that patterning is going to work out. And so British Columbia is a great example because we have Indigenous nations. A lot of that clean energy models that I talked about are being practiced by Indigenous nations in British Columbia. We have some in Alberta here as well. I always hate using money as the carrot on the stick to things, but not only is this all these things we talk about, a relationship is really important and the goals of protection in future, but we've also seen that these clean energy projects, albeit on very smaller scales, are actually really profitable as well, and so it really is that turn towards a biodiversity or a diversity of projects. And I do think that it is piecemeal with municipal, Indigenous, provincial and federal governments on how this is getting unrolled. And I think it necessarily has to be so, because I do think there needs to be that learning of how to make these things successful. And then we see other communities take that up. Yeah. So I hope that answers that question. I'm going to park it there and leave it open for others.
It does. It seems that pivotal, though, is really this notion of really true partnership, that it can't be that Indigenous peoples, for example, are being consulted and so-called accommodated at the last minute, but they need to be full partners in the design, realization, and the benefits of these initiatives. And I think there is a lot to learn from the projects that are already in place. And I love the way you put it in terms of, we're building it incrementally, but we can learn a great deal from what's already gone on.
Yeah. And if I could just add one thing, sorry, I don't want to, because we're going to move on, is your Haida example is wonderful for that as well. So for people who don't know, the Haida do have agreements with the province and the feds, different agreements. And what they do is they actually set aside their differences on sovereignty in those agreements. They say, Haida still says, we hold title to this land. Canada has its sovereign thing. And then they move on and they make this relationship that is more the one that you're talking about, Janis. Yeah. So there's models out there. Yeah.
Good point. Really good point. Sandra.
Yeah, so I think, I do think that there's, I guess building a little bit on what I was saying in the previous comment, I do think that the pandemic has actually emphasized the power of governments working together with the private sector to affect change. What I really think there are some opportunities going forward, and I actually think, at least in Canada, I think that the will is there. There are a bunch of things that we can do. I mean, one thing that would be really great is to dust off the Pan-Canadian framework, which, of course, is the government's climate change plan, which was pretty good. It was thoroughly stakeholdered. It had a lot of different levers for action, and some of which were derailed or slowed down because of the needed attention on the pandemic. But there was stuff in there. Obviously, carbon pricing was one thing, but clean fuel standards and investing in energy efficiency for industry, as well as for buildings, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of those components were underway. And I think, as we are contemplating what rebuilding looks like and what the public and private sector can do together, we kind of do have a playbook that we can go back to, I think. And maybe with some new learnings, there may be some amendments to the way that playbook looks or the time frame for it. I would say the other thing that where I see government and the private sector, again, collaborating, maybe it's another thing to dust off, is the innovation agenda. There was, I think it was the first mandate of this government, or shortly after it, where the innovation agenda was huge. And I, at the time, was actually running, for a few of those years, I was running a small carbon technology and innovation company, actually right up until last year, for 2.5 years. And I can tell you that the government was serious about things like, first of all, we already do a pretty good job in Canada on publicly funded research on a number of topics, including, science around climate change and around solutions to it. Tax incentives for private research and development on this topic and others. There was a number of programs to support fast-growing, innovative companies in the clean technology sector, because one of the things that Canada is known for is birthing companies, because we have such a rich research ecosystem, but then the companies at a certain point can't get enough venture capital or private equity financing, and they end up leaving the country. So there was really a lot of thoughtful work going into trying to rectify that. Startup incubators and accelerators to support little companies to make sure they were investable and well mentored, et cetera, et cetera. So the bottom line is, I think that another way private and public sector can work together is, once we have the breathing room, and it may not be right away, but dust off the innovation agenda, because it's super, super important to addressing some of the big challenges around the environment and climate. And I would just say one third thing. So Pan-Canadian framework, innovation agenda. I think the third thing, and actually I can't remember, but it might have been in the Pan-Canadian framework. It's a really important one, and that is government procurement. You cannot believe how many small companies small innovative companies, really point to that as a signal to the marketplace, when the government actually is the one to, however they can do it, to pilot or try out a new low carbon thing. In the case of climate change, that sends a signal to the marketplace. It obviously brings in revenue to the little company, et cetera, et cetera. So government procurement programs that support Canadian sustainable innovations are another really important thing. I guess the only thing is, do we have any money to do all of this stuff? And we may have to pace ourselves.
Thank you. I particularly like your last comment. The Canada Climate Law Initiative actually sent the Premier Horgan a letter on Monday saying, you could have some novel synergies if you really scale up your procurement policy by not only requiring a climate action plan, but giving small businesses the tools to do it. And then also by really thinking about new ways to partner with Indigenous communities in BC. And so it was one of the recommendations we made, knowing that the mandate letters are about to go to the new ministers. Doug.
Well, the US election has opened up a lot of hope for new international cooperation, new targets, new regulation to take action on climate change, and environmental regulation is going to be a huge part of the solution. Now, there's a conventional view that environmental law should do environmental law and corporate law should do corporate law. Never the twain should meet. And trying to change corporate law to fit broader social objectives is a bad idea, and you should just tell corporations to make money and follow the law. I say you can't put all your eggs in the regulation basket. I think that's a recipe for a failure to address climate change, and I think keeping those kinds of norms in our corporate law will accelerate climate change. First off, regulation isn't a silver bullet because politicians face short-term incentives, there's gridlock, the political system has its problems. But these problems are magnified if, for whatever progress you make on the environmental regulation front, you have an entire architecture of corporate law that's designed to frustrate it, that emphasizes shareholder value above all else, and that signals to managers that what they're required to do is to squeeze every last dollar from every vulnerable stakeholder, skirt every regulation you can, and lobby against the regulations that you can't skirt. It's a recipe for what we saw with the DuPont settlement, where an obligation to comply with the law gets reframed as litigation risk, which can then be quantified and discounted based on time, probability of detection, and amount of expected settlement, and produce absolutely disastrous outcomes for society. And courts are recognizing this incoherence. The Supreme Court of Canada is leading the way in trying to bring corporate law into greater harmony with pressing social needs. And that conventional view that corporations just make money and follow the law, Sandra's made clear that the private sector has moved way past that viewpoint. Sandra mentioned all the creative solutions that lenders are coming up with that are coming out of the private sector that aren't being dictated by some specific regulation. Rather, everybody's come to the table. What Darcy refers to as the diversity of projects is exactly what we need. And it's the only way to bring about a real green transition. And litigation is going to be important to continuing to reinforce the new reality for corporate law, that a corporation isn't just a person, it's a citizen. It's created to serve flesh and blood human beings who have to live in this world.
Thank you. So I'm keeping a close eye on the question and answer box. Please feel free to post a question. We have about 20 minutes left to just have a bit of an exchange here. And just while I'm watching for a question, maybe Darcy, I can ask you one. For those that haven't read your chapter, you talk a lot about the challenge of corporate separateness and this idea of how we're really going to move away from that to more a relationship with nature, with communities, etc. And I just wondered if you had some thoughts on what mechanisms, sort of back on the question of, does this require regulation? Is this norms? Is this a more organic, dialogic kind of way to arrive at new ways of thinking of the corporation and getting past this notion of separateness and therefore no responsibility?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I kind of think about this in three parts. So the first one is kind of what Doug was just talking about. I'm hopeful we're seeing the jurisprudence change a little bit in terms of thinking in this manner. I do think that as environmental, quite honestly, catastrophes will continue, that I think we don't want to get to the point where the jurisprudence has to take that into account. But I do think that kind of separateness and using dismantling the veil in order to hold some sort of accountability, that's like the bleakest version of this, but at least there is that possibility. The other one is that idea of like, what are shareholders doing, right? So we do see behind the scenes that shareholders will have various mechanisms where they can hold corporations to account in meetings, et cetera. They can bring up votes in certain instances as well. So that is something within there. That's obviously, again, these are all like the blunt tools of law we're thinking about. But the norms that you talk about is also with the shareholders as well. How are they communicating with their boards? How are they crafting these? And then the third one is kind of what Sandra has been talking about as well, is that funding piece and that responsibility there as well that can push towards that. So those are the three ways that I think we've kind of skirted around them as well. So the fourth one is this idea of relationships. So it's kind of, I know we have an hour long here to talk, but what I actually talk about in that piece is Wagodawan, which is this Cree principle. So for people who are familiar with Canadian law, you can think about that on the level of, the rules of the constitutional rules in Canada. That's the way Cree people think about that. It's like laws that govern our relationships. And it really does go back to a lot of what we're talking about. It means that we are connecting. There's no way that we're disassociating our actions from the harms that it's doing to other people and beings. And so we're not the only legal tradition that has a relational type principle like that as well. There's numbers of Indigenous nations that do that. So when I think about it in that terms of that, how we can actualize that or realize that is really the acknowledgement of jurisdiction of Indigenous law and legal principles over lands, the acknowledgement of Indigenous legal principles in the arbitration of issues regarding corporate actions and liabilities. So all of those are really speculative because as you pointed out before, we do have this jurisdictional challenge. You didn't put in those words, but that is, so those are four ways that we see it, right? Is that there's this movement and I think they're all really viable, quite honestly. Yeah. So I'll just kind of park it at there.
Thank you. So we have several questions now, and I'm just going to open these up to anybody on the panel who would like to speak. The first one is, what are your views on making it mandatory for corporations to assess and disclose climate risk? Who would like to take it? Sandra.
I'll take that one. In theory, I think that it is a good idea to have companies disclose climate risk. I think the challenge is everybody's got a different idea of what climate risk is. So I think that it kind of depends how we're going to define it. And up to now, up to recently, it was a little bit of a Wild West in terms of what companies were being asked to disclose about how climate change would affect them, whether it was physical impacts of the climate changing or the regulatory and the transition to a low carbon economy effects, so the transition risks. It was a little bit Wild West. And as some of those on the call might know, or some of the participants might be familiar with the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosure, the TCFD, it's climate-related financial disclosure. So that task force published its findings a couple of years ago now, and basically outlined this is how you report on the impact of climate change on your company. And that, which is great. I will say some large companies had already been doing that. Others hadn't. So it was at least a bit of a framework. But I think the important issue is, I still think that people, the readers of that information are all looking for something different. Investors are looking for some very specific things, like how is this material to the financial standing of your company? Is it going to cause financial harm? And therefore, you should have been disclosing it anyway, because there are securities laws that tell you that that's the way it works. But then there are others who want you to disclose everything because they're more interested in just how are you helping to do good in the world, which is a different level or different kind of disclosure. So I agree in principle that you need to be transparent. I think the devil's in the details on exactly how you do it and how you satisfy a number of different audiences for the information.
I think one of the things the CCLI does, the Canada Climate Law Initiative does, is we go out and talk to boards and we really encourage them to get started. And what we hear over and over again actually is that there's a lot of goodwill now in Canada, but there is some confusion about how to get started. And I think one of the values of TCFD is that you can have first steps frameworks. So you can use the governance, risk management strategy and targets to start that inquiry. And then you can graduate to the next steps of really trying to quantify it in terms of financial risk. But it's that old adage, people tend to manage what they have to report. Do any of the other panelists want to comment on this one before I move to the next question?
I'll just say briefly, I think we made so much progress in just making clear that environmental risks are material and ought to be disclosed. And yet it has triggered a bit of a Wild West and the challenge of, okay, how do we actually report this and what data is relevant and how do we measure? But the only way we were going to get to that discussion is with that high level directive of environmental considerations are material. And I think that's a pattern we're going to keep seeing, is where regulators and courts come out with these very broad statements that signal. They don't tell you how to resolve the discussion, but they make it clear that the discussion needs to be had.
Okay, thank you. The next question is a follow-up to Doug's comments. And the question is, how do we encourage corporations to take ownership of green economic recovery without governmental legislation?
I think the courts are one pressure point in litigation. Even if it has a low success rate, even if progress is slow, there's progress. And much like a venture capital fund that invests in a whole bunch of startups, and they know that most of the startups will fail and only one or two will succeed, you never know which piece of litigation is going to be the one that becomes the game changer and that results in a refinement or a redefinition of corporate obligations in a way that really moves the needle. So that's going to be an important area of pressure for continuing to evolve corporate norms. I think investors and lenders are another powerful pressure point. Investors like pension funds that have to think about the interests of multiple generations of beneficiaries, that have to take that multi-generational view. Lenders that are large institutions that are crucial to the Canadian economy and that play such an important role in the economy, and as a result have to think about the economy as a whole over the long term. These are two important channels for changing corporate behavior without having to resort to very detailed regulations, even though regulation is, of course, going to be a huge part of the solution.
Thank you. Other comments? Sandra?
Yeah, I completely agree with what Doug was saying in terms of other levers. I think the lever that I would like to see, it's sort of the magic bullet at the end of the day. The lever I'd like to see pushed more, but it's the tough one, is demand from consumers. At the end of the day, companies have to satisfy, yes, their investors and their lenders, but also whoever buys their product or service. And I think people need to much more aggressively vote with their wallets. And I know that there's a lot to absorb and there's so much information, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, if we continue to buy and not complain about things or buy things that we know are detrimental, or not raise our voices and say, I couldn't find anything else, but by the way, could you please change this? That's one really important pressure point that the consumer isn't using all the time. And it's massive. And when I think about the pressure points on things like climate change, it's really important that the end users, like we all pollute and we all are responsible for emissions. And yet there's only one or two sectors that everybody hammers. But at the end of the day, those sectors are producing something that we continue to use in increasing amounts. So the buck stops sometimes with the consumer demanding, demanding a different end use product or service that doesn't force them to have to pollute. So I think we need to use that lever a lot more than we do.
Thank you. Darcy, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just to add to the great comments by Sandra and Doug here. We also see within, I'm just going to harken back to these clean energy projects that we do see in Alberta here, is that they've done like interviews and studies about them and how they're so effective in the community buy-in and the and the support that they have is they're actually tied into the values of the community. So we start to think about this as law and governance there. And because, for example, we have northern communities that are doing solar projects, and because they understand, they've seen the impact of climate change really directly on their ability to hunt, fish, and trap in these communities, that it was just a no-brainer for them once this opportunity was made available through all the mechanisms that we've talked about to take these up. And then they set it up within their governance of these projects is their community values and laws as well. And so just don't want to take away that normative aspect, which actually kind of gets back to, I think, what Sandra is saying about, voting with our wallets. We can still take our norms and use that to inform how we're spending as well.
Thank you. So the next question that's posed in the Q&A is, should corporate law be changed to mandate the consideration of stakeholders beyond shareholders? So for anyone in the audience that doesn't know, the direction by the Supreme Court of Canada is that it's perfectly acceptable to take into account multiple stakeholders. The Canada Business Corporations Act was amended in 2019 to say that basically directors in acting in the best interests of the company may take into account employees, pensioners, environmental conditions, etc. So this question appears to be, should that be mandatory as opposed to facilitative? Who would like to go first?
I can, I guess the chapter I wrote with Ed kind of covers that. So I guess I have to try something. One thing I would flag is that BCE has that language saying directors may consider the interests of various stakeholders. And that is something that is reflected in the recent amendments. But there's another portion of BCE that uses quite a bit stronger language. They say not only is it the case that directors may consider various stakeholders, they also say that directors have a duty to treat stakeholders fairly, that's a component of the duty of loyalty. That implies to me not just, take what you want and think about what you want, but you actually have to think about your impacts on stakeholders and make sure that you're treating stakeholders fairly, which plays into that obligation to monitor your impacts on stakeholders and mitigate harm. Ed and I have written separately on the question of what happens to that duty of fair treatment in light of these amendments. I think the better view is, since Parliament said their real intention was to really reflect what BCE said and codify BCE, I think the better view is that duty of fair treatment remains in place. It remains part of the common law, and it remains part of a component of directors' obligation to act in the best interests of the company. But here's where I think we can really move the dial as far as the legislature goes. I think the real place for attack isn't the duties, but rather the remedies. For example, we have an oppression remedy in corporate law, by far the broadest in the common law world. The Supreme Court has framed it as a powerful remedy for giving effect to the reasonable expectations of stakeholders. The problem is that the statute itself isn't quite that broad. It says that only the interests of some stakeholders matter: shareholders, creditors, directors, and officers. this is an area where the statute has run behind where the courts are going. And this poses a real barrier to groups who might want to use the oppression remedy as a mechanism to achieve social and environmental justice. So here's a radical idea. Why not change that language in the statute and just say all stakeholder interests matter? And you rely on the courts to define who a stakeholder is and what their reasonable expectations are. I think that would open the door to a lot of creative litigation that sets out new ideas about what the obligations of corporate directors and officers are. And I think that tweak in itself would trigger a lot of proactive action on the part of business.
I think I'd agree with that myself, and I think that you would still have the courts as the gatekeeper for so-called frivolous actions, but you could conceivably open it up. Other comments from anyone? So I'm writing a paper with two Japanese scholars, and one on sort of climate governance. And one of the most interesting things I've discovered is that shareholder proposals are binding on the corporate directors. So as we all know, in Canada, shareholder proposals certainly have normative effect, but they don't have binding effect, and we leave directors to manage the company. So it is making for an interesting discussion between these scholars about what the scope of investor activism can be in Canada versus Japan. Maybe I can just ask another question here. Doug, in the chapter, you talk about the fact that perhaps the duty of loyalty is actually, can be interpreted to be a duty to act ethically. And I'm just wondering, since we have a little pause here on the audience questions, if you can just talk a bit more about that. And just as sort of a talking point, this week there's been quite a lot of activity in the United States talking about perhaps amending Delaware corporate law that to add after duties, directors' duties to act in the best interest of the company, which in the US is defined very much as shareholder primacy, to add something to the effect of, but not at the expense of the environment, human rights, public safety, or the communities in which the corporation operates. And so maybe you could just talk a little bit about this notion of a duty to act ethically.
Sure. Well, we got to this place from one passage in the Supreme Court's BCE decision that says that a corporation is supposed to act as a good corporate citizen. And we thought about what on earth does that mean? And where we came out was the idea that even shareholders are ultimately human beings. Yes, most corporations, a lot of their big investors will be large institutions, but you filter through from institution to institution to institution, you eventually get back to human beings. And these human beings have economic interests, sure, they want to get a return on their stock price, but they also live on planet Earth and have a stake in what happens on planet Earth and in their community. They breathe air, they drink water. Until recently, we went to gatherings with other people and interacted with people outside of Zoom. We had lives outside of our financial interests, and we started hypothesizing, well, maybe that's what that duty to act ethically means. That we're recognizing that corporations are not just serving little bundles of financial interests or little bundles of financial accounts. They're serving actual human beings, and they have to have that in mind when they're making decisions that affect the interests of real people. Would an amendment to Delaware law that effectively imports this duty of fair treatment that I was talking about earlier, the duty to treat stakeholders fairly, making clear that that is part of the duty of loyalty, would that help things? I think that would be a game changer. I think that would radically accelerate the development of the law. It would allow Delaware to import the progress that we've made up here in Canada with our common law. and act as an accelerator for legal change.
Thank you. Any other comments on that particular question? So if not, let me maybe ask Sandra a question. And as you know, the Canadian Standards Association has been working with all the major banks and all the major pension funds and a number of companies to develop a transition taxonomy. So essentially recognizing that Canada's fairly fossil fuel heavy, and that the European Union's green taxonomy might not be perfectly suited to adopt in Canada. The process has been going on since February. I don't know if anybody the panel knows this, but it's somewhat stalled. And partly that's not really enough of an agreement on what you could label as transition finance. And why is this important? Because I think investors want some certainty in how we are actually going to scale up green finance and what counts as working towards the goal of moving to net zero carbon in that sort of shades of green area, as Mark Carney calls it, to get us there. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that and how to facilitate that way forward for Canada.
Yeah. Well, my understanding of what's happening with the CSA Green Taxonomy, we do have two Scotiabankers on that group, one representing Scotiabank and one because he's involved, he's sort of wears his CSA hat. So it's an interesting one. As you said, Janis, the group worked out this, basically a taxonomy just being kind of like the playbook of what's green and what's not green. So that if you're saying, for example, we did $100 billion in green finance, that everybody understands what that means, that they're speaking about the same kinds of things. Or if you're issuing a green bond or a sustainability linked bond, that it means the same thing to everybody. You need a taxonomy. There was some disagreement in the final approval stages about basically there were a number of different points that the group had to go back to the drawing board on. But my understanding is that the revisions are underway, and the stakeholdering and making sure that everyone's voices are heard again and any concerns are tabled is underway. So Canada will have a green taxonomy or a transition taxonomy fairly early in the new year, it appears. And it's really important because it's not a trivial thing to realize that, providing financing to a power producer or an oil and gas producer or a cement plant or whatever, these are all industries that we actually need. Back to that demand thing, the economy runs on these things, and we have a lot of infrastructure built around, particularly around the resource sector in Canada, and there are other countries like ours. I suggest a few countries in the world with similar challenges, perhaps. So the biggest impact we can make on reducing emissions is taking a traditional, company in a traditional sector and helping to support it financially as it knocks back its emissions. A 20% reduction in emissions from a massive company is a bigger impact on the environment than a whole bunch of wind turbines, for example. So we need to acknowledge that fact. And some of the existing taxonomies didn't allow enough flexibility for that. And at the end of the day, it's about the actual impact on emissions that we can make by placing our financial resources in the right places. And in Canada, that is definitely supporting companies as they transition, as well as the new economy as well, both.
Thank you. Thank you for that very helpful answer. So we are coming towards the close of our hour and a half together, and I thought it would be a good time to maybe take a minute or two, each of you, for any sort of summary last comments that you might like to make. And on this one, I think I'll start with Darcy.
Thank you. So thank you for this. Thank you, Janis, for walking us through this. It's been, I've learned a lot. So thank you, Doug and Sandra as well. So I really liked what Doug was saying here about lives outside of financial interest. And I think that's what we're all talking about there in it. And I look at Indigenous legal orders have a lot to offer when we think about not only this question when we're placing it upon corporations, but that individual lives as well, because we do have these ways of continuing that relationship. So again, that term wagotoin means relationship in our lives. And I always think about this story about the Satu Dene, and in World War II, they were unknowingly mining uranium that eventually was actually used for some of the bombs that were used in the war. And it caused a lot of hardship in the community, it caused a lot of cancers. But later, like years down the road, when they found out where that uranium was going, they went to Japan and they actually they asked for forgiveness. And I always think about that story because it's important that we know that learning of our actions is important. And I don't want us to lose that when we start to think about governmental action or these really highly sophisticated things, because I do think those give us that roots. And so I just want to impress upon people that a little bit further. I'm going to cap it at that.
Thank you. And I really encourage everybody to read your chapter because it just raises a whole bunch of interesting and really insightful ways in which one could approach those issues. Sandra, some last comments?
Yeah, I think that what's really been highlighted in this panel is that there are a number of different levers that drive corporations, multinational or otherwise, to take action and to pay attention to environmental issues. And really, it is a bit of a stakeholder model. Certainly, we know that the law is one of the levers and one of the, the stick maybe sometimes. Maybe there's examples of law as a carrot, but I can't think of any right now, but you guys might know. But definitely, the law is an important lever and it solves for externalities and all sorts of, we need it, it's important. But also investors are another lever that corporations, of course, respond to. Customers, very important one, whether it's massive business-to-business customers or people like those of us on this call who hopefully vote with our wallets, raise our voices, etc. And then the other thing that I think companies, the other stakeholder is Mother Nature. I mean, at the end of the day, I think a lot of companies have, especially multinationals in some more vulnerable parts of the world, are paying attention to climate change because they actually see the impacts of it on their operations. Because Mother Nature doesn't care who you are, how rich you are. If you're in the wrong place and the climate is getting unpredictable and hostile and it's wiping your facilities out, then it's doing that. So I think Mother Nature is another stakeholder that we're increasingly being forced to pay attention to. And for better or for worse, I think it's also going to help drive change.
Thank you. And Doug?
For a long time, corporate law has been seen as a barrier to needed change. They had a duty of loyalty that was viewed as a duty to pursue shareholder financial interests above all else. We had securities regulations that said only financial risks are material and environmental, social, and governance risks don't matter and don't need to be disclosed. Darcy raised corporate personality and how rules of corporate personality have been viewed as a way that corporate parents can avoid accountability for what their subsidiaries do abroad. These rules are changing. They're going to continue to change. And in the chapter I wrote with Ed, we argue that unless corporate law becomes more a part of the solution to the climate crisis, it's going to continue to accelerate it. Litigation is going to be vital to generating new norms for how business should operate, for corporate obligations to others. But we also argue that there are already enough data points from this litigation that corporate leaders can see where the law is going and get ahead of it and be proactive. So that's it for me. I just want to say that it's been such an honor to be included on this panel with Darcy and Sandra, and moderated by Janis, who's such a leader in the field that I'm just starting to peck my way into.
So just before I turn it back to Oonagh, just let me say what a privilege it's been to work with the three of you. Congratulations again, Doug and Darcy, on remarkable chapters. I was just delighted to meet, and I learned a lot. And also to our audience for their questions. So over to you, Oonagh.
Thank you so much. You did an amazing job of moderating this panel, Janis. Really wonderful. And I think you brought out so many interesting perspectives from our excellent panelists. So thank you so much, Doug, Sandra, and Darcy, for the wonderful insights you've brought to this discussion. And I also really want to thank the participants for joining us. I know it's difficult to stay on Zoom for any length of time, but I really do hope you gain something from this experience. And I really thank you for the excellent questions that have been posed as well. The ideas that you folks discussed today, you focus a lot on this idea of relationships, and it gives me some hope, really. You talked about the relationships with the land, water, air, living creatures, Indigenous peoples, corporate stakeholders, the producers, suppliers, financiers, shareholders, employees, and customers, the different communities. Even, I think, future generations were being discussed as a relationship we need to think about. And I think what you've suggested is that there are different ways that perhaps thinking about relationships like this will allow us to make progress on some of the most difficult issues. You talked about the examples with respect to COVID, how relationship is helping making progress. And it helps us see that we have, individually, we do have our own power. And if we're not, we don't need to be distracted by some of those overwhelming issues that Darcy mentioned about, political logjams or the Fed-Prov relations that seem to, put everything into buckets, and therefore then nobody else can deal with it. It really does seem that this approach of relationship also allows us to avoid the polarization that we've seen so clearly in, recently in the American presidential election. And it really gives me hope. There's a lot of hope we can have. The Biden presidency will see the U.S. rejoining the Paris Agreement, and that's wonderful. And we can all step up our own agency in taking action to protect the environment and countering climate change. So despite these difficult times, I feel that we've all been, we're very grateful to you panelists and to our moderator for giving us a sense that we can be a bit more optimistic about our power to address climate change and environmental protection going forward. So yes, let's take it on. So thanks again. Please do, you'll see the book Corporate Citizen is available. We hope you can join us. Thanks for joining us today.